Welcome back. And I'm very pleased to say we're joined by another of my distinguished colleagues from the Center for Security Policy, the director of our Infrastructure Security Project. His name is Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Waller, United States Marine Corps Reserves. He's served his country in uniform as well as in this really important role, including as the director of our Secure the Grid Coalition that's focused on trying to protect the most critical of our critical infrastructures, namely our
Frank, thank you for having me on.
warning about for years, including just recently to the Secretary of Energy's advisory board, seems to now be upon us, namely the possibility of a large solar phenomenon known as a geomagnetic disturbance boresighted on the Earth. Tell us what the story is at the moment and what the implications might be.
Sure. Yeah. So, Frank, there are a lot of stories at the moment, news headlines. In fact, just yesterday, I printed some out here. I'll read them just because I think it's so impactful. This is from livescience.com. Giant sunspot doubled in size in 24 hours, and it's pointing right at Earth. Okay. So, what is that sunspot? That's the visual depiction on the surface of the sun of this electromagnetic energy with the plasma of the sun that darkens just before, many times, it's ejected out into space. And those highly charged particles ejecting out into space are something known as a coronal mass ejection, or CME. And so that's what we're worried about, is if that CME were directed at the Earth, it can be extremely problematic.
And problematic in what sense? Is it likely to fry human beings, or is it going to just create aurora borealises or something else?
Yeah, so we'll go to the next headline, Frank, just from 2 days before that. And this is Wired magazine. Here comes the sun to the end to end civilization. And specifically, it says every so often, our star fires off a plasma bomb in a random direction. Our best hope the next time Earth is in the crosshairs, capacitors. Now, what the author means by capacitors, Frank, are the neutral ground blockers, the sorts of devices that can protect our electric grid, for example, from the types of harmful currents that are generated in the Earth's crust. I'm sure your viewers will recall a week ago we covered in great detail exactly how the sun can harm us here on Earth. Not by, as you said, not by frying our bodies or we won't ever feel the heat of it. We might witness, as you said, aurora borealis. That's a visual depiction, but it has everything to do with how that coronal mass ejection, how it affects the Earth's magnetosphere, and how that then can affect our critical infrastructure.
Including devastating the electric grid if it's not properly secured. You mentioned these neutral ground blockers. Talk a little bit about both the nature of the vulnerability, Tommy, to this kind of phenomenon and the efforts that you've been making, including notably recently with the Secretary of Energy's advisory board, to encourage action using some of the resources that have been approved by Congress for infrastructure upgrades.
Right. Yeah. So, Frank, the reality is that it's a 100% chance that Earth will be struck by a coronal mass ejection at some point in the future that is large enough to take down our grid. In fact, it would probably have global implications, but we know here in North America that we're vulnerable. And this has been thoroughly documented. And that vulnerability has to do with these currents, as we mentioned before, that can be induced into big transformers, but they can be stopped. They can be stopped by something called a neutral ground blocker. The Wired author called it a capacitor. The point is the technology exists. And so this is something, and I printed another headline. It's one that I wrote myself last week about the fact that 1/3 of 1% of the Biden infrastructure bill could actually protect the entire grid from this phenomenon by installing these neutral ground blockers. And Frank, as you mentioned, with the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board, that's exactly what we told them 2 weeks ago.
And how was it received, Tommy? And is there any evidence that the advisory board or the Department of Energy is moving, especially in the face now of this present danger?
So, Frank, I have to credit the Secretary of Energy and her advisory board for taking public comments. Every quarterly meeting, they will receive written comments, and then they will receive verbal comments. You normally get about 3 minutes. They actually gave me close to 6 minutes 2 weeks ago. What's odd, though, Frank, is normally they post the written comments when we submit our views to them and suggest all these different things that have to do with the security of the grid. Within a few days, it normally pops up on the website where you can easily see what you submitted to the Department of Energy.
Mhm.
Oddly, Frank, that hasn't happened yet. The video is there, thankfully. There's 6 minutes of me telling them about this problem we just discussed. But the things that I wrote, the things that we published, the facts that show the catastrophic vulnerability aren't yet posted on that site. And I don't know why. And so it makes me a little bit worried.
Yeah, well, I think it should make all of us worried that it suggests that they're not interested in taking the kinds of actions that you're talking about. So, Tommy, if money is not the object, 1/3 of 1% of the billions and billions of dollars that have been allocated to infrastructure upgrades, uh, then what is the problem? What is the impediment to assuring that our electric grid, these high voltage transformers that, as you mentioned, are the backbone of the grid, remain highly vulnerable to this intense energy, perhaps from the sun, perhaps caused by a nuclear detonation from an enemy overhead.
Frank, unfortunately, what we've seen for now decades, the biggest opposition has been the industry itself. And I should remind the viewers that we credit those that keep the lights on with preserving our civilization. We really, the linemen, utility workers out there, I mean, these are heroes. But by and large, the industry itself, its massively powerful lobby, has worked against these common sense security measures for many years. And that's part of what was chronicled in our comments to the Secretary of Energy was the over decade long history of all of the warnings from credible scientists across the country and national security experts, engineers, including
In,
engineers within the Department of Energy itself,
and a blue ribbon
alongside the
commission
industry.
created by Congress for the purpose of making sure that people are clear about the nature of these vulnerabilities and
That's right.
their implications. So, Tommy, if the industry itself is dead set against taking steps like putting these neutral ground blockers in place to protect these enormously expensive transformers, and it's not just that they're expensive. If you have to replace them, you may have to wait years to get one specifically configured to the place in the grid that it has to go. It's hard to reckon why they would be opposed to such practical, near term, and it seems fairly cost effective steps.
It is, Frank. It's very hard to understand. It perhaps could be just an admission that they are vulnerable. It's really counterintuitive to see so much pushback from an industry that really could. The money's there, the infrastructure bill is there. We've already paid for it with our tax dollars. It's a fraction of the cost, but it would be an admission for them to say, well, the last 10 years when we said this wasn't a problem, well, we believe it's a problem now. And
Well,
so, Frank, what we could
that's not a good enough reason to prevent the
no.
actions that will keep people from being killed by the millions. In fact, we mentioned this Blue Ribbon Commission. Tommy, tell us the estimate that its chairman, Dr. William Graham, has given of the kind of loss of life that would be entailed if the grid goes down and stays down for a year or so.
Sure. The Congressional EMP Commission estimated that we'd lose 90% of our population in the first year of a
My God.
nationwide blackout. Now, how they came up with that number was relatively simple, and I personally think it would be worse. And here's why. They just looked at what could the North American landmass sustain in human population pre-electricity. That was about 30 million people, which is roughly 10% of our current population. And so the difference, Frank, as you well know, is that the 30 million people that lived in North America prior to electricity knew how to live without electricity. And
Right.
that's not the case now.
It certainly is not. Tommy, before we let you go, there's a new movie that is coming out very shortly. Tell us a little bit more about the movie, how people can get access to it, and the hopes
Sure.
of turning the movie into a movement to protect our grid at long last.
Absolutely. So the film is Grid Down, Power Up, and it chronicles this battle, the truth telling that we've done for years about the vulnerability of the grid. And as you mentioned, the hopeful thing about it is that there's tools on the back end to help people actually make a difference. That's part of it. You've got to be educated about the threats, and then you've got to get involved in countering those threats.
And how do you do that, Tommy? How do you get access to the film?
So griddownpowerup.com is the website. You can sign up to be notified as soon as it is officially launched, which is going to be in the next 30 days. In fact, just next month, we'll be in Las Vegas with the narrator, Dennis Quaid,
Hmm.
for the official launch at Freedom Fest.
Fantastic. Tommy Weller, we're going to stay on top of this. Pray to God that solar spot moves off dead center, bore-sighted on the Earth, and that we are spared this imminent danger. Um, if we are, we better make sure that it's the last time we are this vulnerable to it. God bless you, my friend, and all the great work you do at the Center for Security Policy, Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Waller. Keep it up. Come back to us with updates as soon as possible.